Welcome to the Mona Charen Show. So glad you could join me. I'm delighted to welcome back an old friend and colleague from the Beg to Differ days, namely Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution and the Wall Street Journal. Bill has written a wonderful new book. I will show it. Anger, Fear, and Domination, Dark Passions and the Power of Political Speech. Bill, nice to have you back. How are you?
Oh, it's great to be back. Well, I'm doing better than the country is. I can tell you that.
Yeah, I know. We all feel it. So your new book is relevant to the moment that we find ourselves in. You have set out, it's a short book, but a very meaty one, where you have set out to examine the vulnerabilities of liberal democracy that come from within. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that. What is your thesis?
My thesis is that liberal democracy suffers from some of the same weaknesses that all forms of political organization do, and some weaknesses that are distinctive to it, as it has developed since its inception some centuries ago. So let's start with the ones that are distinctive to liberal democracy. First of all, liberal democracy is hard because it goes against the grain. It requires all sorts of self-restraint because, coexisting with people who think and act and live differently from you takes discipline. If you look at human history, the efforts typically are to dominate and even extirpate people who are not like you. It takes discipline to accept the need for tolerance and compromise. And it also takes discipline to accept the distinction between what you believe in private life and the norms of public life, on the other hand. That's the whole point of the non-establishment clause in the Bill of Rights, that you may be an extraordinarily faithful Jew, Christian, Muslim, whatever. And a liberal democracy will allow you to live out your creed in most but not all respects. If your creed calls for a public sphere that mirrors your faith, then you're out of business. You're going to be disappointed because, in principle, a liberal democracy can't do that.
Can I just ask you to elaborate on that a little bit? Because you talk in the book, you start out by explaining that liberal democracy's origin story actually begins with a reaction to the religious wars in Europe.
That is the standard historical analysis. There are alternatives, but I think that there is pretty powerful evidence to the effect that the extraordinarily bloody and persistent wars of religion in Europe in the 17th century had a lot to do with shaping the consciousness that led to the emergence of liberal thought. Because once the Protestant Reformation began, there were extraordinary battles that raged through Europe for the better part of a century. Mm-hmm. And it was an extraordinarily bloody period in European history, extraordinarily destructive, extraordinarily unstable. And the question arose, well, if religious pluralism is now a fact on the ground, if Catholic dominance over Christendom could not be reestablished, well, is there an alternative to war and bloodshed? And the answer, to quote the old Soviet slogan, was peaceful coexistence. And then the question was, what were the terms of peaceful coexistence between and among different religious persuasions? And as time went on, at least this is my theory, this is my view, that idea of religious coexistence broadened out to include coexistence among a range of different ways of life and different creeds, not all of which were religious. And that was one of the major, that was a major impetus for the development of liberal institutions and norms and important parts of the Bill of Rights.
So we have a liberal democracy born in the wake of terrible bloodshed that was religiously inspired. We come to the idea that we cannot seek to impose our religious vision on the polity as a whole, but each of us is free to worship exactly as we choose. And that was a huge step forward for humanity. What then, after you achieve that, I think you're at pains in the book to say there are no permanent victories and that there's always backsliding. So why don't you talk about that?
Well, it is always tempting, for one of the parties in the system of peaceful coexistence to become dissatisfied with its share of influence over public life and to try to extend it. And that is true, I would say, for both secular beliefs and religious beliefs. And many conservatives today believe that liberalism in the hands of the Democratic Party morphed into a kind of comprehensive philosophy that I'm a Democrat, tried to impose on them, so that, for example, their views of human sexuality and family life would become devalued, and government would illegitimately attempt to impose its quote unquote liberal view of gender relations and sexuality and family relations on believers. And you can see very, very much the reverse phenomenon happening as well. And one of the things that's happened, I would say, in the past generation is an escalation of sentiments on both sides, that each side is trying to go past the legitimate bounds of coexistence in a liberal society to impose its overall way of life on the other.
A great example, I think, of the distillation of this tension, I think, was the great debate that took place between David French and
Sohrab
Ahmari, thank you, where they had this very debate about, because Sohrab was saying that the fact that there was a drag queen story hour should not be permitted in his vision of good society. And David French was saying, hey, it's not my thing, but, if we can't allow people in San Francisco to have a different way of life, then this whole experiment doesn't work.
And by the same token, and, as I said, I'm a Democrat, this may sound like an argument against interest. But I do think that the whole question, for example, of using public law to enforce things like transgender bathrooms in public schools felt like to people on the other side as though we were doing something illegitimate to them, and they weren't saying that in all states that things should go as they wanted them to go in North Carolina or wherever, but they ought to be permitted to do that. It's always a tough question as to where to draw the line between norms that really should apply to the polity as a whole and those of local application or even application within voluntary sectors, but not in public life at all.
Well, as you said at the very beginning, liberal democracy is not easy.
It's not, and it requires an ever-shifting balance. You're walking on a political tightrope, and you have a balance stick. And if you start to lean too far in one direction, then the maintenance of civic order, domestic tranquility, will depend on bending back to some extent.
So we dove right into cultural issues. It's interesting because one of the things that you say in the book, when you are sort of itemizing the weaknesses of the defenders of liberal democracy. You say one of them is myopia, the sense of, the only important issues that really matter are economic issues.
This is what I call economism. The belief that economics is basic, it's foundational, and everything else is secondary, or even worse, a diversion. Democrats for a long time have accused Republican emphasis on cultural issues as a way of trying to divert working class people and others from their true interests. And there's a classic in that genre, a book called What's the Matter with Kansas?
Yes.
But believe me, the sin of economism goes well beyond that well-known book. It's a pervasive view. And, as you may recall, Barack Obama was a candidate in 2008, got into real trouble when he said that, some peoples or rural small town people are, quote, clinging to guns and religion, right? As though, well, those weren't real issues. And the real issue is what we Democrats are trying to do, to extend health care to all Americans, to provide opportunity, et cetera. Now, that should
and Joe Biden, sorry for interrupting, Joe Biden arguably thought that by passing a bunch of big pieces of legislation that he thought were going to provide jobs for people in red states, that could trump any other issue, pardon the pun, any other issue, any other cultural question.
I think that the defenders of liberal democracy would be well advised to take a broader view of what really matters to citizens. Because if you don't understand the world the way they understand the world, you're going to make mistake after mistake with the best of intentions. That is one of the sins of myopia that I focus on.
Okay. The next one that you talk about is transnationalism.
And I call transnationalism the parochialism of elites, because it's the view that either that national boundaries don't matter or that they shouldn't matter, that people around the world have the same interests, they deserve equal concern and respect, and that nationalism, to turn it around, represents a kind of irrational clinging to old, outmoded loyalties that get in the way of a better world. And if you take that to its extreme, then the idea of borders insulating one group of people from another group of people becomes not only irrational, but in the eyes of some immoral, right? What right does a people that happens to occupy a particular piece of territory have to exclude other people from that territory? Now, I have spent many decades as a political theorist arguing against the view that boundaries are illegitimate and have no role in public life. I will confess it never occurred to me that would become a widespread view with policy consequences. I just viewed it as obviously a non-starter for concrete policy purposes. But lo and behold, as the debate over immigration in the United States wended its weary way from the Simpson-Mazzoli bill and the failures of that bill to various failures to enact immigration reform, and then the somewhat abortive efforts of the Trump administration in its first term to deal with immigration, a reaction grew up that really took the form that borders were presumptively illegitimate, and that the ways that countries, starting with the United States, defended those borders were inappropriate and at best and immoral at worst.
I say this as a very pro-immigration person. I have written and spoken many times in favor of a very generous and open, though not open borders, but a very welcoming position on immigration, which I think helps us and helps the world. But
we share that view, by the way.
Yes,
I've spent decades on this issue, pushing in the same direction without noticeable effect.
I know. But then comes 2019 and the Democratic debates, and there were, 8 candidates or so on the debate stage, and almost all of them, maybe all of them, I think almost all of them, were asked whether they would decriminalize the act of border crossing, and almost all the hands went up. And that was, not very long ago. Okay. Then finally, you talk about naivete about progress. And this is where we really get into some of the meatiest parts of your long essay. I mean, it's a short book, so is it okay to call it a long essay?
You call it whatever you want. I'm just happy we're talking about it. So, like that old Hollywood maxim, doesn't matter as long as they spell your name right.
Okay. So talk about naivete about progress.
Oh, Lord, where to begin? This is a hobby horse of mine. My very first book, published 50 years ago last month, dealt with this question. I mean, I was more philosophical back then, so it was an examination of Kant's essays on history. But he was one of the authors of this progressive view, which he didn't take on board as a certainty, but certainly raised it as a possibility that history was pushing us in the direction of a world filled with liberal republics, and indeed toward a League of Nations. And he can be viewed as one of the authors of the League of Nations, I believe. But the view that history is pushing us forward in a positive direction, towards peace, prosperity, free governments everywhere, has been one of the most pervasive illusions of liberals now for nigh on 2 centuries. In the book, I talk about one of my favorite examples, a book published by a Brit named Norman Angell in, of all years, 1913, in which he argued that there would be no European war, which everybody was starting to fear at that point. Why? Because it would be irrational. Why irrational? Because this dense network of economic and commercial relations would be upended and destroyed by a conflict in Europe, and surely nobody wanted that. And nobody wanted that because we're past all of that. Mm-hmm. And believe it or not, although he didn't get the Nobel Prize for that book in 1913, he got it in, of all years, 1933, the typically foresighted Nobel Committee decided to award the prize to a book arguing that European wars were unreasonable and passe. But then, to my astonishment, I found in David Sanger's book on the new Cold Wars a quotation from Condoleezza Rice. Were you struck by that quotation as I was, Mona?
Absolutely.
I was, as the Brits would say, I was gobsmacked because she said we really didn't expect this new war in Europe, the invasion of Ukraine. We thought we were past all of that, right? That was so 20th century, right? And and it was. And this progressivist illusion that things always moved forward and never backward, I don't understand how that could have survived the experience of the 20th century. I really don't, right? The bloodiest conflicts in human history, the Holocaust, how can you possibly believe that the human race can't move backwards? I think we got lulled into a false sense of security after the Second World War because we created structures that seemed to be working in exactly that way. Not only the global architecture, but also things like the European Union that seemed to make war in Europe passe, and NATO and a bunch of other things that and these were taken to be irreversible facts,
Mm-hmm.
and they weren't. But we fooled ourselves into believing that they were, and here we are.
The title of the book, Anger, Fear, Domination, you talk about the emotions that are innate to human beings and that are always available to be exploited by demagogues. And I have to tell you, Bill, I was reading this and I was thinking, well, yes. I mean, this is all, it shouldn't need to be, people shouldn't need reminding, right? That human beings are capable of unspeakable inhumanity and cruelty and so forth if their buttons are pushed. And yet, I've read a number of liberal reviewers of your book who say, oh yeah, that is important to remember. And I'm sort of thinking, really? Okay. I mean, I guess, people are complacent.
Well, I think there's a connection between this and something we've talked about previously, namely economism. And let me just broaden it out a little bit. If you really believe that human conduct can be explained by appealing in all cases to rational self-interest, right? Maybe as the behavioral economists tell us, with some cognitive distortions built into our evaluation of our rational self-interest. But still, if that's your view of what motivates human behavior, then you will have a hard time understanding why it is that in the name of some passion, people can act in self-destructive ways or be manipulated through the passions into supporting ends and actions that they do not really want, or maybe or the consequences of which they haven't thought through. That would be a better way of putting it. It is perfectly true. I have to say, when I was writing the book, I asked myself exactly that question, the well, duh question, right? Is this really worth saying? And then I was reminded of George Orwell's injunction, especially in dark times, to restate the obvious, because we tend to lose sight of the obvious. The spectacles through which we see the world screen some things out. Now, let me connect this to something we talked about previously. If you look at the history of liberal political thought going all the way back to the beginning, you will see a deliberate effort to set the passions aside. And you can see this. You can see this when you're reading the philosophical works of theorists such as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. The passions were seen as the source of danger, of disruption, of instability. And there was an effort to create a political order in which the impact of these passions would be minimized. And what was the formula for doing that? Well, it began with the idea that if self-preservation is the highest good, then you can use the fear of death as a way of getting people to think reasonably about the conditions under which premature violent death would be minimized. And one way of doing that was to try to sideline the people, like aristocrats and religious fanatics, for whom that kind of sidelining would be particularly hard to achieve. And But the formula that later liberal thinkers came up with was the substitution of commercial relations for war. The idea that if people were consumed with getting and spending, if the ambition was for the accumulation of wealth rather than territory or domination, that the world would be a better place. That substitution of one desire, namely the greed, even the desire to get more and more, to acquire more and more, for the desire to dominate other people through war or domestic hierarchy maintained by force, that's what led to books like Norman Angel's book. That book didn't come out of nowhere. There was centuries of thought behind it. And one of my favorite passages in the book is the long quotation from Voltaire about the London Stock Exchange.
You and I have a tendency to zero in on the same historical quotations. I also love that. Yeah, it's very interesting.
But the whole point of that is that when people
tell the audience what it is.
Voltaire tells of visiting the London Stock Exchange, and the point is that people of the most varied outlooks, different religions, are not fighting with each other. They're competing with each other, but it's a peaceful competition that either leaves everybody somewhat better off, or at least doesn't lead to the kinds of losses that that generate the desire for revenge. It's a formula for peaceful coexistence, a world dominated by commercial relations, and that is a fundamental. But all of that leads liberals to a kind of forgetting of the passions. And so there, in my own profession of political theory, there were decades where an enormous amount of thought was given to the idea of rational deliberation. That was the norm. That was the highest good. And there wasn't a lot of discussion about those aspects of our humanity that tend to disrupt and even displace rational deliberation. Namely the passions that I talk about in my book.
It is really hard to understand why and when those things go awry. So, for example, the Netherlands has been a thriving commercial society for centuries and has not given way to the dark passions. I mean, it's been conquered by the Nazis, but domestically, that it worked for them. Great Britain worked for them. The United States worked for us for the longest time. And so, even though some people have, certainly religious people have decried what they called, Father Newhouse called the naked public square, to worry that, just a commercial republic was kind of thin gruel and that people needed something deeper meaning. It seems to work pretty darn well, this commercial republic idea, where people find their meaning privately elsewhere, but not in the public sphere. That's not the only source of meaning in life for people. So what do you say to that?
It's hard to disagree. But it does seem to be breaking down, doesn't it? And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, and a previous book on the rise of opposition to liberal democracy in the form of anti-liberal populist movements. I think it's a very complex question, which might be the occasion of a different discussion, to try to figure out why the breakdown, why now. But let's start with your pregnant phrase, thin gruel. Right? There is, I think, a sense in which liberal democracy as a political form is thin gruel, because in the name of agreement, it requires us to pare down, even to minimize what all of us must believe in the name of maximizing our freedom as individuals and members of groups to believe what we want, as long as we obey the law and the essential norms of a liberal society based on the proposition that we're all created equal and that our interests are entitled to equal concern and respect. And if you have a rich civic and religious life, then that formula can work pretty well. Tocqueville's America was not a bad place to live unless you were black.
I was about to say, or Native American.
Or Native American. And this is a point that many sociologists, famous ones like Bob Putnam, have been making for a long time, although I think they didn't draw out the consequences to the full. And that is, if the sources of meaning within a liberal democracy are pared down, they wither, whether we're talking about voluntary associations or religious groups, then the demand may increase for meaning in the public square that is no longer being provided by civil society, by voluntary organizations, and by faith. And it certainly has been an extended period during which, and this has been amply documented, civil society has tended to decline. Membership in voluntary associations is much less pervasive and robust than it was at its peak in the 1960s. Fewer and fewer people belong to organized religious institutions. And in the world in which people are increasingly atomized, then the meaning to be gained from what I'll call vertical relations between a leader and followers, can become a kind of substitute source of meaning. It becomes a quasi-religion, and it provides not only the satisfactions, but also the dangers of a religion, namely the desire for exclusivity and dominance over competitors. So that is one way of telling the story. It is not the only way of telling the story. I think we have to acknowledge that another piece of the story has been the rise of what many people in Western societies regard as disappointing developments. The stall out of mass economic progress, which characterized the first 3 decades after the end of the Second World War, deindustrialization, which hit some parts of society and some geographical areas particularly hard. The rise of demographic diversity, which a lot of people didn't see coming. Go back to the debates over the Hart-Celler, fundamental immigration law of 1965. Nobody expected it to lead to a demographic transformation of the United States. It just happened.
In fact, its advocates promised that it wouldn't happen.
Exactly. But it did. And so people woke up one day and said, wait a minute, I don't recall voting for this. And people had not been prepared really for the reality of an increasingly demographically diverse society with immigration from previously unrepresented parts of the world. And that happened not only in the United States, but in the UK, throughout the European continent, for a range of reasons, not all the same reasons. Not all of them comprehensively reformed their immigration laws and then 60 years later woke up to a different population. Some of them experienced it all at once rather than a time release capsule, like Germany, for example, in 2025, with millions of Muslim refugees on their doorsteps. And Angela Merkel says, we can do this, and open the doors. And
you said 2025. I think
didn't I say 2015? I certainly meant
2015. Right.
2015. Yeah. And 10 years later, AFD is arguably the leading Party in Germany in no small measure because of this issue. Nigel Farage in the UK for exactly the same reason. So this is not all on the decline of civil society and religion. There are also, I think it's important to keep in mind, we can surely have two thoughts in our head at the same time. One more materialistic and the other more spiritual, coming together to weaken public attachment to liberal democracy, which for most people is not valued for its principle. It's a tree that's known by its fruits. And if the fruits are less plentiful or bitter, they will respond accordingly.
So I do agree on the immigration issue. I mean, I think it's undeniable that all of these societies in Europe and the United States are responding to in the very same fashion to the same perceived threat. And it's David Fromm's line that he uttered many years ago, but nobody has improved upon, which is if Democrats won't enforce borders, then the voters will ask fascists to do it. And that's right. But you and I might differ on other matters like the economic stuff, where I don't actually think that the China shock, for example, was real. I mean, I think it was minimal. I think we've made much too much of it. And the fact is, we still are a country where manufacturing jobs go begging, and they have done consistently. And we've had a decline in manufacturing employment that has been secular going back decades, back into the 1950s. Every single year, we employ fewer people in manufacturing. China shock was had a trivial effect. But
we have debated this more than once, Mona.
rather than going down that rabbit hole, I know. Rather than go down that rabbit hole, I want to talk about, because I don't think any listener to this podcast needs to be reminded of the dark rhetoric and tactics that are in use by demagogues, most particularly in our own country. The use of fear, the use of resentment, the encouragement of the will to dominate, which is also unfortunately part of the human soul.
Yeah, I want to pause at that point for just a minute.
Okay.
On this issue of domination, because I think we tend to underestimate it.
Mm-hmm.
I am not a Christian. I'm a Jew, but I have to admit that I've learned a lot from Augustine's view of this matter. He pioneered, I believe, the phrase called the libido dominandi, the urge to dominate, which I think he regards as the central vice of the human condition. And it is not evenly spread through the human race. This is a point that's been wonderfully made by all sorts of people, famously by Abraham Lincoln in one of his first public speeches, the Lyceum Address in, I believe, 1838, where he warned his fellow Americans about the tribe of the lion and the eagle. That is, people whose desire for domination, if not checked, could overwhelm the institutions that had been created for precisely the purpose of checking this. If you don't believe me, take a look at some of the concluding essays in the Federalist Papers, which are filled with warnings. And I have always viewed the U.S. Constitution as first and foremost an anti-tyranny document.
Absolutely.
And James Madison has this wonderful quotation, which I've used many times, to the effect that the concentration of all powers in a single set of hands, whether legislative, judicial, or executive, is the very definition of tyranny. And it is, it's a danger always, because the desire to dominate is pervasive among some members of every society. There are, and Machiavelli also talks about this. There are
Of
people
course, he was for it.
well, no, I actually think not. But
Okay.
that's a long discussion.
Yeah.
But he talks about the middling class of people, as Aristotle did, who are satisfied to live decently and securely, who do not spend their lives trying to dominate other people. And there are a few, but a very significant few, who are not content with an equal share in society or an equal share of power as one among many citizens, and who are not content to share power with others, even when they achieve some elective office that has a measure of power. They want it all. They want it all. And
Yeah. Well,
this
we were
was,
supposed to have designed a system to thwart such people.
yeah, well, the founders, the founders were political realists and psychological realists of the highest order, right? And if you read the Federalist Papers, you will find none of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's, you know, belief in human innocence, at least before we started to get civilized. You will find none of John Dewey's dewy-eyed optimism. Uh, you'll find the sense that human beings are a mixture of good and evil, a classic view, certainly in Judaism, my religion, where we have, the you know the good inclination and the bad inclination at war against each other. And they were not optimists that human beings left to their own devices would develop the good and subordinate the bad in the name of getting along. There had to be constraints that would prevent the worst aspects of their nature from being carried out on over the heads and on the backs of other people. And that's what institutions were supposed to do. But it turns out that even the best designed institutions, being human creations, are imperfect and therefore, in some circumstances, won't be adequate to the purposes for which they were designed and instituted. And here we are.
John Adams said that if we did not have a virtuous and religious polity, then the Constitution would be no firmer than, what did he say, a whale going through a net, or words to that effect.
Yeah, well, I think that was an extreme formulation. I prefer Madison's formulation in Federalist Number 55, to the effect that that Republican government draws on the good side of human nature to a greater extent than other forms of government. If you're living in a tyranny, then a virtuous citizenry is not so important for political stability. But if you want a free government, then it is. And then he went on to say that if the dark and negative picture of human beings being painted by the adversaries of the Constitution were the truth, then there would be no hope. So there's no question about the fact that that the founders, even though the greatest institutionalists, I think, collectively in history, were reluctant to rely entirely on institutional contrivances. But I think we tended to forget about that side of the coin and assume that we had designed, as somebody put it at the time, a machine that would run of itself.
Yeah.
And there were theorists, including the theorist I studied first, Immanuel Kant, who really did believe, and he said that the problem of designing a stable set of republican institutions was solvable even for a nation of devils, quote, as long as they are intelligent. In other words, reason can be used to overcome the dark side of our nature. And because we can use it to construct institutions that will nullify that. And that has turned out to be an overly optimistic view of what institutions can do.
Okay, but you do discuss in the book the uses of rhetoric, and you point to examples in American history of leaders who have used rhetoric to appeal to the better angels. Is that the answer to the dire situation we find ourselves in now? Is it in finding people who can summon the right rhetoric to respond?
That may not be a sufficient condition, but I believe it's a necessary condition, especially now. And with your permission, let me just walk through a couple of these examples, because the more I studied them, the more of an impact they made on me. I focus, as you mentioned, on anger and fear as two sort of primal human emotions that leave us open to manipulation by others for their own purposes. And when FDR took office in March of 1933, he inherited a fearful nation that feared for the future, right? The economy was virtually at a standstill. Quarter of the population was out of work. The banking system had ceased to function. And FDR perfectly sized up the condition of the people of the country, as being so dragged down by fear that they had lost confidence in their ability to work collectively to get themselves out of the situation that had rightly provoked these fears. And so when he stood up and said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and then went on to make more precise what he had, in mind, namely what he called stark, unreasoning terror that paralyzes our capacity to turn, to turn our plight into an advance. By the way, I've spent some time reflecting on his choice of the word paralyzes in that context. Imagine, here you are, you're a strapping, callow young man, who was thought to be sort of, arrogant, full of himself, and a lightweight.
Also a princeling.
A princeling. He goes on vacation, gets polio, and suddenly he's helpless.
Yeah.
Right? And someone else might have abandoned his hopes for his life, but he didn't, despite what must have been the extraordinary fear and terror that he experienced in the early days after he got polio. Will I ever have a life again? Will I ever walk again? And he went through the experience of overcoming the fear that paralysis brings and turning it into one of the most remarkable public lives in American history. So I think in telling the American people the only thing they had to fear was fear itself, he was drawing on a deep well of personal experience. And that is one of the reasons why it carried such conviction and why they believed him. And now, of course, he had to back it up.
By the way, most of the public did not know that he was paralyzed to the degree he was, but that doesn't matter.
That doesn't matter because he knew. He knew. Exactly. He brought it into play as, it's understandable for us to give up at this point, but we don't have to do it. We can overcome this. And then he proceeded to show people that there were things that could be done. They thought that their money in banks was gone forever, and in 2 weeks he'd reopened the banking system, created the FDIC, told people in a memorable fireside chat that I also talk about a little, that your money is certainly going to be safer in this new banking system than under the mattress. And he made them believe it, and the money came back into the banks, and that part of the economy started to function again. More complicated than that. That's oversimplifying, but you have to back it up. And he did, but the prelude to backing it up with action is to get people to stand behind you as you act. And he did that. And I think that speech had a lot to do with creating the conditions within which action was possible. The other one that I focus on was directed not against fear, but against anger. And this is a really fantastic story.
It is. And by the way, probably much harder to fight raw anger in that moment than fear, don't you think?
Yes. And I recently watched a clip. The speech I'm talking about is the real Robert F. Kennedy, his speech that he gave in Indianapolis the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. For people who don't know the story, let me set the scene because it's extraordinary. He was flying to Indianapolis in the air when he got the news about the assassination. And when he landed, he turned to one of his aides and said, "My God, I bet a lot of the people in this audience, which was an African-American audience, haven't heard the news," which turned out to be true. This was 1968, no cell phones, none of that. And it turned out that a lot of people had not heard the news. So he took it upon himself to break the news to them. And then he said, your anger, the temptation, to anger, to destruction is entirely understandable. And then he devoted the rest of his speech to talking them down from that entirely natural human emotion in those circumstances. And here again, he drew upon his personal experience. He reminded them, as they were trying to absorb the news of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, that his own brother had been assassinated. And he talked about himself and what that had done to him. He quoted Aeschylus, of all people, on the human condition. And in 5 minutes, in 5 minutes, the mood of the crowd changed. They dispersed peacefully. And Indianapolis was one of the few American cities of any significance that did not erupt into violence on that day, or ever, right? And I'm not saying that RFK's speech was the only reason that didn't happen. And I've actually studied some of the civic history of Indianapolis. There were other things going on that contributed to that good outcome, but it could have been very different. Now, I'm invoking the power of speech for good as well as for ill in the final part of the book, because I think we tend to forget about it. And people who are accustomed to govern, as many people in my tribe are, tend to believe wrongly that deeds will speak for themselves. You pass bills, right, and that's it. You've done your job. No, that's not. You have not done your job. You haven't done all of your job. You also have a job of public explanation. And you also have the task of sizing up the mood of the people. And when some negative trends are setting in, to try to address those directly and to do something about it. We tend to think that speech is mainly used to whip people up to do bad things. We forget about the positive potential of political public speech. Let's use the old-fashioned term rhetoric to draw us in a better direction. Now, rhetoric is not omnipotent. If you don't believe me, recall the famous peroration, the ending of Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural, where he said, we are not enemies but friends. We
One
must
of
not.
the greatest pieces of political rhetoric in American
Right.
history.
And then he talked about, the mystic cords of memory that connect us.
Mm-hmm.
And weeks later, Fort Sumter, we have the bloodiest Civil War, in just about anybody's history. So when the situation is already out of control, rhetoric fails. But in the armory of forces other than institutional forces that we need in order to draw us toward our better selves and draw us back from the brink, political speech, I would argue, plays a central role. We have forgotten that. And so, yes, to answer your question, I believe, however implausible it may seem on this day, I believe that Americans in the not too distant future will respond to a message of political peacemaking and appeal to the restoration of domestic tranquility. This is not true for the extremes, but I'm enough of an optimist to believe that a lot of people in the middle are beginning to say, whatever their particular persuasion preferences, this is going too far. Enough, or should I say enough already? And so I am not without hope that a leader who speaks to the desire for a greater measure of civic concord, not for forgetting about our differences, but in dealing with them in a more productive, less conflictual, less violent way, will get a respectful hearing if such a person arises in either political party. I can't prove that, but I'd rather bet on the hope than assume that it is impossible and therefore not even try. So I am hoping that somewhere, at least in my party's primary, someone will step forward and say, I believe what you believe. But I also believe that there are higher stakes in the current competition, not only within our party, but in the country. The maintenance of our republic as a peaceful place where people can go about their business with some expectation of order and of being rewarded for their efforts and not subjected to violence or the threat of violence, not subjected to a political system that, because of its divisions, has become incapable of addressing your problems. Let's try that message out, see how it goes, and we can't be worse off, God knows, if we try that line of argument. How could we be worse off?
I'll let that be the last word. Bill Galston, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Mona. It really has. And by the way, that was the best interview on my book, by an order of magnitude, because you actually walked people through it from the beginning to the end. You didn't jump around, and you tried to give every pillar of the argument its due. And thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for writing it.
You couldn't have done that without reading it pretty carefully, in my opinion.
Well, I'm not one of those people who interviews an author without having read the book. I never understood how people do that, but apparently the practice is widespread.
Oh, I can testify to that. I bet you've written books and then discussed them with people who hadn't read them.
Oh, like the overwhelming majority of the interviewers.
You can always tell.
Yeah, absolutely.